An American comedian a number of years ago said that the average American citizen is an exponent of the art of doing things the hard way. And this particularly applies, I think, to our modern psychological procedures. Here indeed we really fight it out. The first basic premise, of course, that we function from is that psychotherapy consists of finding a good psychologist, paying him well, and doing as little as possible yourself. Now, this is always the hard way of accomplishing anything. It is the same problem largely with the physician. We look for a doctor who will take away our aches and pains without interfering with the processes which cause them. The reason being that we like to cause them, only we do not like to suffer from the results. In psychology in the West, we have made an almost brutal procedure out of trying to straighten out the inner life of the individual. We may place him under some kind of psychological regime for a year, 2 years, 3 years, or 5 years. During this procedure, we use our typical scientific attitude. In the first place, we have limited the field almost completely with materialism. We take it for granted that a rational, intelligent, integrated individual has practically no beliefs whatever. Beliefs become sickly factors in his difficulty. So by the time we get rid of all of the things that might make him sick, he has nothing left to live for. He should be a well-organized automaton. Well, the individual naturally, subjectively resists this procedure. And as a result of his natural resistances, he does not come out of the problem as well as he should. Also, we have never yet devised a method of developing a psychologist who did not have frustrations of his own. This means that in many instances, the seances or sessions are really mutual misery contests. I know a good many people who have paid a good many $10, $15, and $20 fees in order to hear what was the matter with the doctor. Well, of course, there is something in it we do gain by finding out that other people are more miserable than we are. This may be a kind of indirect therapy, but it is rather expensive and time-consuming and takes away something of our confidence in the physician. If he is unable to integrate his own affairs, we may wonder what he will do with ours. All of these problems are built upon certain basic concepts. One of these concepts is the American idea that wherever a problem arises, head into it. Just simply take it on and be a martyr to it. Struggle desperately against it. The harder you fight, the better you are, whether you win or not. This type of theorizing is nice, can be morally sustained with appropriate adages, but may prove rather devastating in terms of energy and resource. Long, long ago, in the early days, when China had not really fallen into its particular kind of neurosis, the Chinese had a wonderful engineer and scholar who worked on the great irrigation systems of ancient China. And of course, among other things, it was necessary to build dams in rivers and streams. So this Chinese developed an idea which since took over and has practically controlled this concept, even to the present time in engineering. When you wish to put a dam in a stream, the first thing you must do is deflect the stream. You must build a temporary bed for it elsewhere, so as that the area where you intend to work is dry and you can get at it. But in psychology, Western man does not do that. His idea of the right way to build a psychological dam is to go out in the middle of the stream and fight the river head on. Every time he piles up some concrete, the river washes it away. So he starts all over again. And he believes that the way to win is with determination, bullheadedness, and absolute failure to learn from experience. If he does succeed, ultimately, the cost of the dam is 1,000 times what it should have been, and this is called modern financing. The Chinese had another way of approaching this, and it was part of their philosophy of life, part of the life philosophy which they gained from their contact with ancient religious and philosophical systems, especially those of India. It was the conviction of the old Buddhist priests and monks that there has to be some way in which an individual can live well without killing himself trying to do it. There must be some way of being happy without being miserable doing it. That there must be a way of being spiritual without being completely frustrated. These terrible extremes with which Western thinking has become addicted have not proven successful in application. Scientifically, we have gone far. Psychologically, we have gone far. But we are not able to produce the healthy and happy person. And today we have more psychotics than ever before. And a good many of them are psychologists, because they cannot be assumed to be different from the people they work with. The fact that a man becomes a clergyman does not affect the fact that he is basically a human being with human problems. He may be completely dedicated to religion and to ideals, but he is still confronted with the problem of himself. The same is true of the doctor, the lawyer, the judge, the psychologist. All of these persons remain themselves. And though they may be completely dedicated and be very honest, honorable persons, there are very few of them that can cure their own problems. And the various systems of instruction which they have received are not sufficiently concise and precise to enable them to do anything for themselves, or very much for themselves. So in our Western way of life, the sick are trying to cure the sick. The unfortunate are working with the unfortunate, and the blind are trying to lead the blind. That all of this should be loaded with good intention is obvious, but that it might not be very satisfactory is also obvious. Today, the average person is in trouble for one basic reason: lack of self-control. Now, how he is to secure this self-control is quite a problem. He is surrounded by every conceivable inducement to lose it. He is being tempted and prodded and pushed and pulled in every conceivable direction. His patience is tested almost beyond his endurance. Every effort that he makes to balance his budget and be a reasonable person economically is frustrated by temptations beyond control. Almost every phase of life penalizes the individual who tries to control himself. Yet without self-control, no individual can be well or happy or integrated. As a substitute for self-control, we have developed a series of sedations. These sedations, like Milltown, are intended to relax the individual away from the pressures of his own personality. These drugs will temporarily achieve their result, although the consequences of them are not yet fully understood or known. We may find that in attempting to create a false situation by artificial means, we are hazarding some other part of man's natural economy. But these drugs have as their purpose relaxing the individual. They have as one of their byproducts the letting down of tension by reducing the intensity of the nervous, emotional, mental reflexes. In other words, the individual who gets groggy gets better, according to our way of life. If he can become a little bit unable to think at all, he is markedly happier. For nothing seems to make him more miserable more quickly than thinking. Perhaps it's because the exercise is so unusual. And also, if we begin to think, it is hard to remain placidly foolish. When we begin to think about what we do, we are not nearly as happy about what we do, because we are not doing the kinds of things that would make thoughtful people happy in the majority of instances. If we discover, as through artificial means, that worry and tension can be reduced by the temporary blocking of the nervous emotional reflexes, we must then naturally conclude that a large part of our tension is due to the exaggerated activity of the emotional nervous system. If we allow this to beat upon us, if we allow ourselves to whip ourselves with our thoughts and feelings long enough, we will be sick. Having achieved this kind of sickness, it does not occur to us that we are the physician capable of correcting our own ailment. It does not seem reasonable to us to impose any self-discipline upon the cause of our own trouble. The individual relaxes under the effect of hypnotic drug. It is a strange but amazing phenomenon that after so many thousands of years of life and living, the individual can only relax by artificial means. He has not yet learned how to relax. This is due, as one doctor pointed out, to the fact that we live in a very stimulating civilization. It's so stimulating we can hardly live in it at all. And what is this wonderful stimulation we are receiving? It's everyone else's irritation that we call stimulation. Everyone else is excited, miserable, and uncertain. This mass emotional condition we regard as highly stimulating. Certainly it is stimulating because it keeps us in a continuous uproar. It makes it impossible for us to go to bed at night and have any idea of what the economic condition will be the next day. It leaves us constantly on the verge of war. It causes us to wonder what atomic weapon will be next. This is not stimulation in a constructive sense of the word. It is nothing but irritation, creating a condition of sickness in all who come under its influence. If, however, as the sedational drugs, the hypnotic drugs, tell us and reveal to us, most of the problem can be corrected by slowing down the emotional mental tempo of the individual, then it is rather obvious that this can be done naturally as well as artificially. If man is in trouble because of lack of mental emotional control and direction, he must realize that drugs will not cure the trouble. To take enough of them to keep himself perpetually relaxed will ultimately destroy him. If it is necessary for his well-being and his integration that he attain relaxation, this should be the principal objective of education, civilization, culture, and science. But relaxation does not fit into our concept of living. We want to be on the go every moment, and we consider it to be inevitable that we shall wear out the individual as a nervous and mental creature, so that by 65 or 70 he is a wreck if he lasts that long. Unless he is a wreck, he hasn't lived well. He hasn't really been a part of things. He hasn't been dynamic. And we begin to think of the individual who survives 70 as suffering from some kind of Oriental abstractionism. He couldn't get that way and still be a healthy member of our society. In this situation, congestions, of course, change with times, but the principles of tension do not change at all. You go among primitive people and you find that they are also subject to tensions. Theirs are of perhaps a smaller kind, more personal and intimate, but it makes very little difference in terms of tension whether the individual is afraid of an atomic bomb or whether he's afraid of a tiger that may come into his hut at night. He is still under tension, under the stress of life as he lives it. And life is a conflict between the desire to survive and the hazards and the dangers which are attendant upon life. No individual, as the Oriental proverb says, is safe until he is dead. Up to that point, something can happen to him in this world. After that, according to theology, things start happening to him somewhere else. The Oriental systems of psychology were then developed not by a people totally different from ourselves. This idea of difference is rather an exaggerated and artificial situation. These people have problems as we have them. Truly, they have a different tempo. They have less intensity up to now than we have had. But their intensities are also building rapidly. And unless they also are able to integrate their ways of life, their attentions may ultimately do to them what ours have done to us. Up against the background of this rising sea of tension, we find the emergence of a great religious philosophy that was born in India over 2,500 years ago, and that is Buddhism. Within the last 10 years, Western modern psychologists and psychiatrists have begun to recognize that perhaps they are more indebted to Buddha for the principles of psychology and psychoanalysis than they are indebted to Freud, Adler, and Jung. These thoughtful mentalists are beginning to see in Buddhism the dim outlines of a psychotherapy that is solid, that is based upon values, based upon an acute apperception of man, an understanding of the real situation as it is. And the recent discoveries in such fields as those of the quietude drugs and so on are all indicating the correctness of the Buddhistic position. And this position is based upon one simple problem, namely that you can never make a difficulty smaller by continuing to make it important. If you wish to solve a problem, we have to always assume the fact that the power to solve is bigger than the problem. And Buddhism brings out simply that man as a being is bigger than any problem that confronts him. And the only reason why he does not solve the problem is because he falsely accepts the fact that the problem is greater than he is. That this itself is an illusion and a delusion. And man's problem depends not upon the magnitude of the difficulty, but upon the wrong position or wrong attitude of his own consciousness in relationship to the problem. Also, Buddha points out clearly that you can never cause a problem to disappear by thinking about it continuously. You can never actually repeat and repeat and repeat problems until they become less. The more energy you impose upon them, the more problem you have. Now, psychology seems to reverse this in practice, but it does not. The idea that if you will talk about a psychological pressure greatly and often enough, you will finally reach a climax and will then be relieved of the problem, is not actually what happens. What happens before this occurs is that through repetition, you as a being suddenly comes to the realization that you have had enough of the problem. And the moment that realization comes inside of you, the problem ends. So the work of the psychologist is merely to make you exhausted, worn out, tired, and angry at the continuance of the problem. And when you reach this point where you really, honestly are tired of carrying the problem, you haven't got it anymore. But to do this over a period of 2 or 3 years is a long and difficult problem. It also defeats another important circumstance. All specialized approach to problem can only solve special problem. The individual can spend a great deal of time mastering a certain mood or emotion in himself, or trying to. Perhaps he does bring it under control. But he has other emotions that immediately step forward and start new lines of difficulty, which also must be met and worked out. Thus, psychotherapy becomes a problem continuing through the entire life of the individual, because he is still the fountainhead of continuous problem within himself. There must be some better way to handle it. There must be some way in which the individual can be his own physician without breaking his neck, wearing himself out, or frustrating his life. And perhaps even worse than that, being a nuisance to everyone else. The whole concept of Buddhism based upon the factor that you cannot exhaust problem by brute force and awkwardness. You cannot fight these things because they are actually dreams anyway. They are misty things that have no substance. If you shoot the arrow through it, there is nothing there but a ghost. It does not die. You are shooting ghosts. You are trying to destroy ghosts. You are trying to whip ghosts. And when you get through, you have wasted time and energy, and the strange, ghastly specter is uninjured. There has to be some way of getting at the basis of illusion. And the basis of every illusion is the individual who permits it to develop within himself. Illusions are not part of nature. They arise from the emotional, mental relationship of living creatures with nature. Nature itself is not fearful, nor is it terrifying, nor is it filled with incredible miseries. What we call our understanding of life is an attitude. And it is this attitude which, if it is right, helps us, and if it is wrong, makes us sick. The education of this attitude, the restoration of normalcy within ourselves, therefore depends upon a careful examination of the factors within our own nature which make sickness possible in our mental and emotional lives. The first factor which has to be present in any achievement, good or bad, any activity, constructive or destructive. There is one thing that has to be present, and that is energy. The worrier is using just as much and even more energy than the individual who is building a city. The person who hates is hating with energy. The individual who is discontented is discontent with energy. Behind every mood, behind every activity of the human being is energy. All this depends upon the continuous flowing of energy into an area set aside by our own mental determinism. We have circumscribed our problem. We have lived in it. We are drowning in it. Buddhism says very simply, take away the energy. Do not try to fight this thing out step by step, because you cannot. At this particular time, you have not even enough clear-sightedness left to do it. Even prayerfully and sincerely, you cannot solve a problem that has gone beyond a certain point within your own knowledge. If the problem is bigger than you are, you have lost any further advantage from the study of it, because you are simply under pressures, and pressures are not intelligent. Consequently, remove energy. Now, psychologists and your friends, when you start worrying about these things, will say, forget it. Easy, simple. And wonderful enough, if you took one of these 40-year, lifelong problems to an old Zen master, or an old Shingon priest, or an old Nichiren priest, he would probably look at you, smile, and say, forget it. So you would go away angry at him. You would say, that's awfully easy to say. Anyone can say forget it, but try it sometime. And the moment you try to forget it, you can think of nothing else. It is no longer something you can voluntarily control by trying to forget it. If you settle down and you say, each day I will worry about it 1 minute less until it swallows itself in oblivion, you can't do it, because each day you will worry about it 1 minute more and finally end up swallowed in the problem yourself. You cannot forget it. It will come back in your dreams. It will be part of your own involuntary nature. You cannot forget it. What then does the old Zen master mean? He cannot mean that you blot out, as with a wet cloth, the inscription on a slate. You cannot do that type of thing. Yet there has to be a way in which you can become superior to the problem, so that it ceases to be a problem. And the old Zen master, under certain pressures, will probably tell you how to forget it. He will tell you to go out and look at a sunset. Now, he doesn't think for a moment that one afternoon on the beach will end your problem. He is trying to tell you something. He is trying to tell you something that you would not believe if he told it to you in straight words. Something you will never accept until you do it yourself. What he is actually attempting to bring to your attention is that the only way that you can forget a problem is to follow the advice of the Chinese engineer of so long ago and build a temporary bed for the stream of energy that circumscribes the problem and just leaves the problem there. And the problem, deprived of energy, simply ceases. You don't fight it. You simply turn the consciousness toward something else. you starve the problem to death. To have a bad problem, you must be one-pointed. To be one-pointed with a bad problem, you must have your mind on one thing above everything else, and that's yourself. That is why you have the problem. So you have to find some way of transferring this self-energy, this energy that is constantly flowing into your own small pattern in some other direction. You must transfer it. This release is a problem of transference. It is the changing of the flow of energy from a pattern that is detrimental to a pattern that is not detrimental. You do not blame yourself. You do not say, I was wrong to have this fear, or I must get over it, or people will not respect me if I remain the same. I can't afford the psychologist. I do not want to take the drugs. These things die with the rest. You have no longer the intensities in the direction of the problem at all. As the old Taoist monks pointed out, the real way to keep a problem is to determine to get over it. From that attitude, you'll have it forever, because you declare war on it. You organize every resource you have. You go out with your heavy artillery and your strategies, and no one declares war on nothing. Therefore, the moment you declare war, you are admitting the problem. You are restating the problem. And every effort to have victory over it makes the problem worse. Because usually in the effort to get a victory, you must break other laws and create new miseries for yourself. The answer is to look straight at the problem with a peculiar kind of Buddhistic insight, looking at it so straight that you do not see it. It isn't there anymore. Because in order to see the problem and be in the problem, you have to think crooked. If you think straight, it isn't there. This sounds very platitudinous, but there has to be a technique by means of which it can be done. The human being has to have an answer. Man is not created to become dependent upon others of his kind for his survival. The survival of consciousness within man is governed by law, and that law is honest. And that law says that each individual must work out his own salvation with diligence. And that means that no matter what kind of a problem you're in, there must be a way that you can work it out and come out of it victoriously. And the only possible way in which you can work it out is to know more about the interior working of yourself. In this way, you can estimate the problem correctly, not by its consequences as we see them around us, but in terms of the forces which we have permitted to cause the problem to come into existence. So let us assume for a moment that by means of these negative habits that we have, negative visualization, negative emotion, negative thought and pressure, we are gradually able to transform our lives into monstrosities. Lives that no longer have any real happy meaning for ourselves, in which there is no longer contentment, peace of mind, or freedom of thought to dedicate our purposes to things that are meaningful. We live along day by day, unhappy, and constantly complaining and seeing in others the causes of our unhappiness. This situation is met by the Bodhisattva idea, which lies deep in the Eastern religious philosophy. Primitive Buddhism was a very austere doctrine. Some remnants of it are still to be found in Ceylon, which is now the stronghold of the small vehicle or the Hinayana school. Buddhism of this type taught that there was only one way out of problems, and that is the total renunciation of life. That the individual who wanted nothing could not suffer from any of the complexes of those whose desires are frustrated. The person possessing nothing could lose nothing. The individual who had no personal life could not be injured by another, or restrained, or restricted, or made miserable. So Hinayana said, renounce all. Take the holy life and live it to the end. For the only purpose for our existence in this world is holiness. And this holiness is unworldliness. And this unworldliness is freedom from the power of the skandhas, freedom from the power of the senses, of the emotions, of the attitudes, and of the thoughts. Only by renouncing them all can the individual achieve the nirvana. This school was never very popular because it could not touch the life of the householder. There were people who wanted to grow and who wanted to be better, but they were not mentally, emotionally, or psychologically capable of the complete renunciation of life. Nor could they justify such a renunciation with the collective needs of each other. The father and mother could not walk out and leave the infant, simply because the adult person must find aloneness, must go into solitude, must renounce all things, including the ties of the flesh. Incidentally, this same problem arose in the early Christian church. We had it too with the coming of monastic orders. And a great many strange and many tragic things occurred in the struggle between the householder and the monastic laws of the early church. But about the beginning of the Christian era, a change came in the structure of the Buddhistic doctrine. And this was the introduction of the Bodhisattva Concept, by means of which this strange, mysterious journey from worldliness to perfection, from this illusionary sphere to the absolute Mahaparinirvana, that this journey was broken in midway by a strange and wonderful place which was called the Paradise of Amitabha. Here was a heaven world that still had existence, that still had a kind of reward factor locked within it, a world of beauty, a world of grace, a world of happiness, of music, of art, presided over by the noblest parts of man's nature. And the rise of the Bodhisattva doctrine also brought with it this concept of the great visualization of the transcendent being. The person was impelled or inspired to make a change in his own series of visualizations. Actually, we are partly induced, at least, into our problems by a visualization within ourselves of our own purpose. The individual whose visualization, therefore, is temporal, is essentially directed toward material things, whose visualization is power, wealth, position, dignity, or merely the visualization of the fact that he can do exactly as he pleases. Such visualizations have a powerful effect in determining the course of conduct, and most of this effect is ultimately detrimental. In Christendom, a visualization factor has been introduced. Carlyle explains this to us in his study of hero worship. Hero worship is a visualization. We know this even on the levels of juvenile delinquency today. When the young people worship the wrong heroes, there is trouble. When man worships the right hero, he seemingly gains a certain courage, inspiration, or self-direction from this procedure. Buddhism would not invite him to worship the hero. Buddhism, however, would cause him to arrange new heroic concepts in his own life. If then the individual, by a new understanding, derives certain impulse or certain incentive from visualization, he has achieved something. The greatest good that has been done in Christendom in the last 29 and a half centuries has not resulted from Christian philosophy or Christian religious doctrine. It has resulted from the universal visualization throughout Christendom of the Christ type in man. It has been the individual generating within himself the image of the good man. It is the visualization of the Christ in you. It is the selection of the Christ as hero. The recognition that it is upon this comparison, upon this visualization, that the devout Christian person wishes to build his own life. He wishes to be like this positive, creative visualization. Therefore, over 200 races and many nations have visualized the face of Christ, have visualized the concept of his life, his teachings, and his way. They have seen this kindly, gentle, at the same time strong person. They have seen the unselfishness, the dedication, and the sacrifice. They have felt the tremendous presence of this power in their own lives. And by this visualization, they have refocused the point of awareness away from self to the Christ power. This is exactly what the Mahayana also accomplished in Buddhism. It created a being, the Bodhisattva. This being was the ideal type. In Buddhism, it was not historical. It was a concept. And in some respects, this was helpful, because the historical factor in the visualization process has a tendency to bring it down again to a physical level, whereas the non-historical factor leaves it free in space and removes the historical boundaries, which become psychologically dangerous in some instances. The Bodhisattva, therefore, is a word, a term, represented in Buddhist art by a splendid likeness. A likeness, however, which derived its authority from an artist, not from the Bodhisattva itself. And in the course of ages, particularly in the Wei, Tang, and Sung dynasties of China, artists derived what they called the ideal types for these celestial beings. They were gracious, beautiful, flowing examples of the highest creative artistry of these people, and we still admire them tremendously in the beautiful porcelain and bronze figures of Kuan Yin and Amitabha and Manjushri and the other great beings of this pantheon. But each of them actually has a likeness only according to the vision of the artist that produced it. But this traditional likeness is archetypal, because it became, in the case of every artist, the visualization of the best that he knew and the most that he was. It was also unworldly, because this visualization was never completely based upon a model. The Oriental masters never used physical models in the production of their religious art. Everything was done from within, from contemplation. Naturally, they were affected by other masters of their own schools, whose visualizations influenced them. But each time it was an internal impression that had to be brought out and manifested in some kind of a form or nature. In the same way, your concept of the Bodhisattva ultimately becomes merely the statement of your own overself. It becomes to you the symbol of all virtue and all goodness. But virtue and goodness have no universal meaning for you except in terms of your own experience or your racial tradition or the background of values which you accept. And as this becomes more and more personal, and the individual seeks to find these values within his own consciousness, obviously, these transcendent concepts are clothed in our own noblest sentiments. Now, generally speaking, these noble sentiments are the ones that are neglected. In Christianity today, in our own homes, in a nominal Christian world, we believe in the brotherhood of man, and there is nothing we compromise more frequently or consistently. The brotherhood of man is something that is applied to other people, but ceases the moment it appears that it might be expensive to ourselves. We believe also in honor, in faith. We believe in doing good when ill is done to us, but we do not act that way. When we are injured, our first thought is revenge. We are also taught that when problems come to us, that we should retire into the closet and pray to our Father in secret, and that our Father who hears us in secret will reward us openly. We do not do this, however, factually in most instances. We are also strongly reminded that we should not lay up our treasures in this world, where rust can corrupt and thieves break in and steal, but that we should lay up our treasures in heaven or in the invisible part of our lives. But this is not our prevailing practice. Our prevailing practice is to figure, as one man told me, that when his bank account was large enough, he could afford to become religious. And this is the thinking which we term practical. So here we live in a world dominated by a religious conviction which is essentially idealistic. But that conviction does not move in upon us as therapy. When it moves in upon us at all, it is in desperation. We turn to religion only when everything else has failed. And that, again, places an ulterior motive upon our religious conversion. And with the ulterior motive there, the stream of our religious faith is polluted at its source. If it is true, and we know that it is true, that we hold these gracious realities to be real, whether we practice them or not, and in the long course of ages we reward and honor those who have practiced them, even though we do not do so, we can then realize that perhaps the key to our difficulty lies in the fact that another faith, not our own, has pointed out certain truths by which we can make our own work. And that other faith is Buddhism. It has shown to us that truly where our hearts are, there our treasures will be. And that the individual who transfers his energy from the contemplation of his own misfortunes to the visualization of the universal value and integrity of truth and love will ultimately be rescued. He will be rescued simply because he is using the same energy that he is now using to make him ill, and that the very same process which now locks him in a negative complex can create in him also positive spiritual habits. The simple fact of the matter is that intensity and repetition puts us in a rut. But intensity and repetition of insight build in us the transcendent being, also the product of repetition, also the product of visualization. The same energy that makes us see how miserable we are is the energy which makes us able to visualize our own transcendent integrity. If, therefore, we take the attitude of the East, namely that the Bodhisattva represents the archetype which we ourselves create for our own integrity. The Bodhisattva is the being in us that we wish we were. It is the being in us that comes the nearest that we know to keeping the best that we believe. It is that part of ourselves which is the closest to our spiritual insight, the closest to our value, the closest to our integrity. The visualization of this, the continuous building of this archetype, by the direct application of energy to constructive end, means that the habit of good is just as easy to cultivate as the habit of worry. The habit of faith requires no more energy than the habit of fear. Why then do we fear rather than have faith? The answer is that we have derived the inspiration for our moods from the chaos of our environment, rather than seeking within ourselves for the divine archetype, the visualized power, by means of which we can create the image of good in ourselves. The moment we begin to build this, we are then able actually to forget about this negative pattern which has begun to weaken the moment we begin to grow. We are not forced to fight our way through the complex. We are not forced to overcome step by step every delusion that has at one time or another possessed us. All that we are required to do is come into the clear internal visualization of our own integrity and live according to it. Live according to it in a very simple manner. Let's see how we can live according to it. Suppose you, as a person, visualize within yourself some holy being according to your natural faith. Perhaps you would visualize that within you is the holiness of Jesus. Perhaps within you the sacredness of the Kuan Yin, the deity of mercy and compassion of the East. If this visualization begins to grow, if you build the internal sanctuary of this dream, if you build the ecclesia, the chapel, the shrine, the high altar of good, within your own consciousness, using the very same energies that you have been using building images of misery, you will find a greater artistry, a greater achievement, a greater joy. You have lost nothing. You have merely reduced the power to lose everything. If this visualization begins, even in the simplest way, and Buddha is attributed as having said, although it probably arose in one of the later schools, that one moment of the visualization of the divine within is enough to counteract the evils of 10,000 lives. This is, of course, naturally a kind of euphony. It is a pleasant statement, a gentle, kindly thought. But it is true that this one visualization of faith undermines ages of fear. gradually causing the individual to recognize the possibility of the beautiful existence in himself. Having created some kind of a visualization and assuming that we want to be like something that is beautiful, that we want to be like this being, the Eastern mystic begins to feel this being moving in him. When he makes decision or performs action, he inevitably and instinctively performs an action that is consistent with this being that he now internally visualizes as in himself. He chooses to be the hands and feet of this splendid vision and cannot by nature perform an action inconsistent with it. It is no longer a matter as to whether this action is loaded with danger. It is no longer a problem of conflict between this action and desire. If the individual's inner life is bound to a concept of value, happiness is in obedience to value. And the person is no longer torn between the decision to do what is right and the decision to do as he pleases. This visualization should not be either a difficult, tense, or problemed situation. Because as Buddha points out in his philosophy, actually the visualization of archetypal beauty or archetypal truth in man is his natural state. It is something he is allured away from. If the individual therefore ceases to do that which is not so, the brilliance of the reality blazes forth. Man is not expected to create reality. He cannot. He can recognize reality, but he can create unreality. Thus all things which are in themselves negative are creations of man. Reality itself, eternally resplendent, is something that has an eternality in it, which is man's hope of glory, is complete and continuous strength in all time of stress and uncertainty. In a practical way, then, we start according to this Eastern concept. The Eastern monk or the mystic perhaps has the painting representing one of these celestial beings. We do not need the painting. All we need actually is something within ourselves that continuously reminds us that there is something better there than has ever had a chance to express itself. Also, that our natural desire is for peace, that our natural hope is for wisdom and love and understanding, but that by various false doctrines we have perverted our standards until we no longer really know what love is, and we do not reward true love. We do not realize that the friend who reprimands us may be the one who really loves us. We do not recognize the need for a great charity of consciousness, nor have we realized that charity is not merely the bestowal of alms, but comes from charitas, which is the bestowal of self in the act of devotion or dedication or true love. These things, as we begin to unfold insight, become more and more real to us. It is no longer how many we hate and how we can rationalize ourselves out of it. The transcendent being does not hate. And if we cling to the transcendent being with all of the devotion and love that we have, hate dies. The transcendent being is not envious. Therefore, we cannot sustain any form of envy if our consciousness is fixed upon this principle of good. The transcendent being is not selfish. Therefore, every time selfishness moves within us, it is a cloud upon the face of our consciousness. It does not mean that we shall win all these fights instantly. nor does it mean that we can maintain such a mood immediately. But it is quite certain that if we took this concept ourselves and worked with it, we would get further toward universal solution to our problem in 3 or 4 years than we would in trying to fight through that problem on the level of dry material intellectualism for the same length of time. It means that in a comparatively short time, the habit of consciousness would begin to take over. And whenever a moment arose in which discord or negation pressed in upon us, it would be met by an instinctive reflex of consciousness, instead of by a dismal darkness such as meets it today. If then the transcendent beings, by the cultivation of it, is caused to become this gracious person in the body, this constitutes an almost complete reorganization of the psychic life. This tells us that in the Buddhistic doctrine, actually, the illumined soul is the Bodhisattva. It is located in the middle distance between the outer world of body and the intangible, inscrutable, abstract absolute of nirvana. It is located somewhere between spirit and matter, a glorious garden of graces. And this garden of grace is the human soul, which we now in the West regard largely as the cause of all the plagues that flesh is heir to. We regard it now as something that is sick, and that the sickness of it communicated to the body will corrupt all of us. We have now the idea that the soul has to be educated, that it has to be saved, that we have to go to work upon it and try to build it into something that we can adjust to a material way of life. We want to have an economic soul, a commercial soul, and a scientific soul. And from all of these we will rot. Actually, the purpose of the soul is that it shall be the shrine of beauty, ideal, and truth in us. When we unfold the soul by the conscious discipline of philosophy and religion until it becomes the leader of the body, being in all things greater than the body, superior to it, then indeed the functions of the body will themselves become refined and glorified, and our outer life will be filled with grace, rather than be subject to the innumerable disgraces with which we are familiar. Thus the soul is saved or redeemed by consciousness directing the will away from a world of illusional suffering into a subtle fairyland that is a kind of an illusion also, but the beautiful illusion of good. We say an illusion because ultimately, according to Buddhism, the paranirvana remains, the strange, inscrutable abstraction that no human being can penetrate. And here alone lies absolute reality. This psychic world is not absolute reality. It is relative truth, relative reality. Just as man trying to be good is not in possession of absolute good, only good as he knows the good, only truth as it is given to him to see or understand the truth. But no more is required of him. This relative good, this relative truth, this relative beauty, these are sufficient to bring the medicine of love and understanding into the psychic life. A man builds, therefore, an inner paradise where now he has a purgatory. He builds within himself something to which he can relax. He isn't afraid that the moment he lets down the barriers of his will, a negative torrent of sorrow and trouble will burst through into his objective life. He is not terrified by these things. He knows that if he is quiet and peaceful, the beauty in him will move forth, and that he is never more dynamic than when he is permitting the soul to be itself, to move through into its own natural and proper expression. To understand this, is to begin a kind of therapy upon oneself which can have the greatest enduring practical value. It is to begin by a daily consideration of the gradual integration of a being. We can sit down, perhaps first with a piece of paper and a pencil, and try to draw the mental picture of the kind of being we know we want to be, the kind of virtues we desire to possess, the kind of innate graces that would make us proud of ourselves, the kind of nature we would like to possess in order that we might inwardly pray, meditate, reflect upon living, and build a strong and wonderful communion with the spiritual root at the source of life. Thus, this soul life is also a kind of priest, wearing the vestments that we have woven for it out of our own virtues and our own consecrations. And little by little, we give the soul the definition of great artistry. For the great artist in this world is the one who can, by art, perfect his own soul. And the great artistry is this artistry of contemplation, of meditation, of visualization of value. And by this visualization, reasonably, consistently, regularly performed, man creates a habit, a good habit, against the bad ones that he now has. He creates the habit of being able to enter into a state of goodness, a state in which there is neither war nor rumor of war, a state in which he perceives by degrees that he possesses within himself the power to be greater than he is. And the moment he is greater than he is, that which is less than himself will fall away of itself. Perhaps 6 months, a year, 2 years, must be devoted to the gradual clarification of the concept of the transcendent being, the God self, the soul self within man. As this being grows in clarity and definition, it becomes the ever-present help in time of trouble. It is this being that then gradually takes the place of the personal ego, which is a negative projection by the same means. This person in us, which is always hurt, always miserable, always conflicting with something, always afraid it isn't going to win the fight, this whole personal integration that we know is nothing but the result of a mental fixation. It is a mental fixation that is killing us and is destroying by degrees all the beauty of our way of life. This personal self is not an immortal being. It is simply the product of pressures. Now, if we reverse these pressures, if we release them, if we get our minds off of negative into positive channels of creative visualization, we build a counter-ego. We build another kind of self. A self which we build by intent and purpose. We pay no more attention to this other self. For the more attention we pay to it, the more tyrannical it becomes, for it is a perpetual infant, ever ready to be a despot if we give it the chance. Instead of that, we withdraw the energy with which we build it and slowly bestow this energy upon the building of a new self, a self created by art and yoga, a self that is the result of purpose and intention rather than by incident, accident, and so-called act of providence. So little by little we become architects of an inner self, a self in which we embody all of those values which we know to be the most important and the most real. And by degrees we build the kind of self that thinks like these values, moves us like these values. And in the old idea, ultimately this kind of self becomes possessing rather than obsessing. The individual voluntarily and gloriously becomes the servant of this self because it is doing the things that the individual knows are right. His allegiance is no longer the allegiance of a slave to an autocrat, but the allegiance of a free man to a deity which he respects or to a hero that he recognizes. This free allegiance comes only when the merit of the situation makes such allegiance possible. In time, this transcendent being, which the ancient Orientals, of course, called both the Bodhisattva and ultimately the Buddha in the heart, the unfoldment of it gradually brings the life under the control of the noblest part of itself. It gives the individual a series of experiences, and from these experiences he immediately begins to learn things. And he learns some things that are very astonishing to him. He learns, for example, that this path of so-called renunciation of worldliness, which he fears so heartily, and which appears to him to be a frustration of every natural instinct that he has, is not this at all. He discovers that the joys, the simple natural solutions of things, all these values that are important lie with this transcendent self and not with the ego that we know. It does not follow that the believer in these things has to be poor, downtrodden, and negative. It does not mean that he cannot have a positive, constructive, active life. It does not mean that he has to go out in the forest and sit under a tree, nor that he has to agree with everybody whether they're right or wrong. These negative attitudes that we have about these things arise from the negative effort to remain as we are and to talk ourselves out of the things we should do. The fact is that the creation of the transcendent being has never as yet reduced the state of man. It has made the state of man more significant. It has brought to him all the values that he needs and wants. It does not make it impossible for him to make a living. It does not take away from him the association of his friends and family. Because true value, true beauty, true truth in man does not divide him from others. Because there is within each person a root. And although this root may be obscured by circumstances, the majority of human beings recognize and respect value. And one of the reasons why we are constantly cheated is because of the larceny in our own hearts. The reason why we have enemies is because we are an enemy. The reason why others suspect us is because we suspect them and we also suspect ourselves. The moment these things are clarified, the reaction of other persons is also clarified. And this gradual development of the transcendent life within man does not take him out of his world or make him useless, nor does it deprive him of any of the natural pleasures and good things of living. In fact, it makes it possible for him to enjoy. It makes it possible for him to do good things and appreciate good things without fear, doubt, and resentment, remorse and jealousy, envy and hatred forever taking over the administration of his relationships. There is a tremendous happiness in rejoicing in the good that comes to others. But today, we instinctively resent it. This resentment is not a true emotion. And if we did not have this emotion, but rather rejoiced in the common good, we would all be happier, have better health, more energy, and more friends. The fact that we do not have a strong enough integration within ourselves takes from us those we love, makes for a lonely old age, and enables us to stand constantly in need of criticism which someone will bestow. Actually, the creation of this transcendent life within us, the gradual visualization of the trueness of ourselves, and the gradual, continuous emphasis upon this by daily meditation, daily visualization, will in time create within us a positive psychic force. And this positive psychic force will draw more energy to itself as it develops, and in so doing will exhaust the energy available for negation. Without knowing why or how, we will therefore wake up some morning finding love instead of hate governing our relationships, finding that faith is stronger than fear, and that we do not have to argue ourselves into the fact there is nothing to fear. Rather, we awaken with the deep, inevitable, and immovable realization that there is everything in the world to love. All these values coming into us simply remove darkness or remove ignorance, as the rising of the sun of towardness, toward which we move. The rising of this sun scatters the shadows under which we now live. Therefore, the radiant halo around the divine head is the symbol of the light which casts out darkness and which leaves man to stand in the light. And when the light of soul shines upon the world, it is a good world. And these things which we have called evil disappear, for they arise only in the errors of man and not in the workings of the law. To know this, to gradually become able to practice it, is the transforming of life from a theoretical path of virtue to an operative way of creativity. And thus man, becoming the architect of his own psychic life, gives it the kind of integration which cannot be assailed, because nothing can be assailed by its own inferiors, and that which is superior to darkness cannot be destroyed by darkness. Thus all these things which flowing into us fill us internally with negation accomplish their various unfortunate ends simply because our own internal is not filled with positive value. Once it is filled with light, darkness cannot flow into it. Once it is strong in value, that which is not valuable cannot corrupt it. And when it is healthy, that is, when it is set in normalcy, which is health, and it is the normal power of the soul to love the beautiful and serve the good. When this state is achieved, abnormalcy cannot unseat it, because abnormalcy has no power over that which has established itself in normalcy. And by degrees we can become our own priest and our own physician, thus fulfilling the proper law of ourselves. And I'm convinced that something of this pattern must ultimately be added to our present psychological program in order to give it completeness and to give it the true solutional power in this world of distorted and disordered values from which we all suffer so intensely. Time's up.